Hey everyone, last time we looked at what trade protection is, so we looked at tariffs, we looked at subsidies. Now we're going to look at arguments for and against using those trade controls or protections. So we'll start with the arguments for. We've got health, safety, and the environment. So, for example, Australia has a trade restriction on the import of high-powered guns, right? We don't put a tariff on them. We don't subsidize our own industry. We just ban them, right? Where they are not allowed to be imported, and that's because we don't want people to kill each other too much. Okay, so one reason. Another type of protection is for safety. So in Australia, we've got these things called Australia-New Zealand standards. So for example, every sort of ladder that you buy has to meet the Australian standard for ladders, right? So specific details, features that they need to have to be sold in Australia. And so that means that can protect our local manufacturers of things, because other companies in other countries can't be bothered trying to meet our exact standards. So in a way that is protection, but we just do it for safety. We don't do it to protect our industries, we do it for safety. Also, we restrict imports on fresh fruit and vegetables, and that's just for our safety and the environment, that we don't have things like fruit fly and other diseases in our food. Government revenue is one. So this is a tariff diagram. We know what that looks like. We should be able to just draw in what the government revenue is. We should be able to quickly pause, draw up this video, draw the government revenue. So for example, we'll use Trump as an example. Tariffs on steel, we're going to talk about them a fair bit. The revenue is this little box here, because they are the imports. Q3 to Q4 are the imports, and the extent of the tax on each of those imports is the difference between the two world supply curves there, as we know. Another argument for is the protection of infant, or sometimes called sunrise industries, but infant industries. So there are new industries that don't benefit from economies of scale because they're small. So they need protection from tariffs in order to be able to compete with imports in the short term, and then they think they'll be able to grow and be able to compete well in the long term. Right, so there's my little illustration of it. The government holding the little infant industry baby and looking after it, caring it until it gets big enough to fend for itself, right? Now, how does this work? Before the tariff, local industries can only produce this much. Then after the tariff, we can produce this much. So they get to produce more. They can develop economies of scale. We know what economies of scale are: lower costs per unit as you produce more. Next, and the revenue that they get. So not only do they produce more and get economies of scale, but they get more revenue. So they get to charge a higher price than they otherwise would be if they were in direct competition with imports. So previously, this is what, in free trade, this is the revenue they would get. They only produce this much, selling for this price. Now, they produce more, they sell for a higher price. So this is their revenue. Clearly, that is bigger. So that is better for the infant industry. Protection of jobs. This is one of the big reasons why Trump put on tariffs on steel. He wanted to protect steel workers' jobs. He thought that was uniquely American, and he appealed to the voters on that basis. So it works the same here. Before the tariffs, this is how much steel they produced. Then they put tariffs on. Imported steel costs more, so they produce more. If they're producing more steel, they need more workers. So it does protect the jobs in that industry. National security. Again, Trump. He's a popular guy in trade, education. So national security as well. If you want to make these things, that's a tank. If you want to make these things, you need lots of steel, right? So it's considered an argument for tariffs on things like steel that you need to be able to raise your own defense force, your own army, and that you don't want to rely on foreign countries for your resources to do that. You want to be able to make your own steel to make your own weapons. So if the steel industry died because of imports, they wouldn't be able to make all their own weapons. So that's an argument for putting in place these tariffs. And it's an argument that Trump himself used as well. So again, how that works. If we're making more steel than before, right, then they are more able to produce the steel that they need for their defense industry. Okay, anti-dumping. We haven't heard what dumping is. Dumping is the practice of selling a good in international markets for a price below the cost of production. So, for example, we make something for $100 here and we sell it cheaply overseas to destroy their industries. We might sell it for $50 overseas to wipe out their industry. Then when their industry is wiped out, well, we raise the price again, right? And suddenly we've got a much bigger market to sell to. That's the idea of dumping. Now, China claimed that Australia was dumping its wine in the Chinese market, so selling it artificially cheap in the Chinese market in order to gain market share. That is probably not what happened, but what this meant was, if this is the Chinese market for wine, we've got supply of China here. What would have happened is, from their perspective, they're saying, well, we can't compete with this unfairly cheap Australian wine. So we'll put tariffs on it and we'll start producing more of that beautiful Chinese wine we all love. And so they go from producing Q1 over to producing Q3. And that counteracts the effect of the other country dumping their goods cheaply in your country. And that can be considered a valid reason for trade protection. To protect against unfair competition, so like dumping, undervalued currency, we're going to look at that in a sec, and misused administrative protection. So any other reason it is sort of fair to put in place tariffs to counteract that. So we're going to use this guy again, Donald Trump. So he's saying here, China drops the price of the currency to almost a historic low. Classic Trump grammar. It's called currency manipulation. Are you listening, Federal Reserve? This is a major violation which will greatly weaken China over time. Now, what if they drop the price of their currency? That means Chinese exports are cheaper. So people are going to buy Chinese exports rather than things from the US, right? That's his argument. So that was one of his arguments for putting in place tariffs on Chinese goods, because they weren't playing fair. That was his reasoning there. All right, so we'll go through that further in class. Economically less developed countries, they do need to diversify their industries, and trade control and protection can help. So diversification, they want to increase a variety of goods so that they're not reliant on the price of one good for determining the fortunes of the country. Because in Africa, where a lot of the poorer countries are, they're majorly reliant on one export. So Chad, 92% of their exports are oil. Malawi, 78% oil, and so on, right? So what they would want to do is put tariffs on other goods so that they can develop those industries. So that would be their infant industries, right? It helps them diversify so they're not so at risk. If the oil price crashes, Chad and Malawi, they're going to lose all their money. So they're at great risk if they don't diversify their economy. And one way to do that is with tariffs. Okay, misallocation of resources. So we're going into arguments against trade protection. So quickly draw up the tariff and subsidy diagrams and show where the welfare loss is. So that's from the last video. Hopefully we know how to do that pretty well. Okay, here's our tariff diagram. And our welfare losses are in here. So we've got to remember why these are welfare losses. Dead weight loss due to inefficient production. So more is being produced by producers who aren't as efficient at producing it. So that's going to lead to a welfare loss. We're not allocating our resources effectively. And we're also not allocating resources to the right things because that price is now artificially higher. We're not consuming as much of what we wanted, which can't be good. Resources aren't being allocated to their best use, to their most desired use. So that is no good. And the subsidy, so like on cars, for example, this is smaller because there is no price rise. Remember, with a subsidy, the price stays at the world price. That's a big difference between the two. But we're still, like when Australia was subsidizing its car industry, instead of producing Q1 and only the most efficient car producers in Australia producing, we were producing at Q3. So Holden, who weren't particularly efficient at making cars, kept on making a lot of cars, and that was inefficient. That wasn't a good use of our resources. Retaliation. So if you put in place trade protections or tariffs, it's pretty naive to think that your trading partners won't respond or retaliate. And this is exactly what happened. There was a trade war between the US and China. So pretty much what happened, Trump says there's going to be tariffs on $34 billion of Chinese goods. So on goods that the US would normally spend $34 billion importing from China, they put tariffs on those goods so that they wouldn't buy as much from China. China responded, well, we'll do the same to your goods, right? So then Trump had to respond again. Well, we'll put more tariffs, another $16 billion of Chinese goods. And then they escalated it again, the Chinese. Tariffs on $34 billion of US goods. So everyone sort of lost out. Everything got more expensive for both countries because they did import a lot from each other. Okay, increased costs, higher prices. So what happened in the US? They put tariffs on steel and aluminium. They're inputs. They make a lot of things out of steel and aluminium. So increased costs of production, we know this diagram, that increases prices. So everything that used steel and aluminium became more expensive. So it really hurt the economy in that way quite a bit. So SRS shift to the left, higher price level, and growth and unemployment would not go well either. It actually also reduced their export competitiveness. So they've got a huge car industry. So a brand like Chevrolet, they need steel and aluminium to make their cars. Steel and aluminium was more expensive, increased cost of production, of course. So then they're trying to export their cars to the rest of the world, but their cars are now more expensive. So they were less competitive, and that would go across all the industries where they were exporting things made with steel and aluminium. Right, so big argument against doing that. Less choice. So when we had high tariffs and subsidies on Australian cars, then it really kept other car makers out of the Australian market. So the Holden Commodore was our most popular car for a long time, and arguably that restricted consumer choice. There just wasn't the same level of other cars in the market to buy from. And the domestic firms, when they're stuck behind that tariff wall, we call it a tariff wall, that they're so protected, they don't have that intense drive and incentive to become more efficient. So this sort of thing, benefit of free trade, doesn't happen. No good. So big argument against trade protections there. Okay, and that is the end of that. So let's make sure we take decent notes. I hope you've been listening, because if you haven't been listening, you would not have got a lot from this. So good luck. I'll see you in class.